Developing now at noon, deputies in Hernando County have arrested 4 people in an alleged murder-for-hire plot in connection to the shooting death of a 17-year-old girl back in February. Isabella Scavelli was a junior at Hernando High School. A relative was also injured by gunfire. And today, 4 suspects face state and federal charges. 3 could be imprisoned for life.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
It was a cold evening on February 7, 2023, in Hernando County, Florida. The kind of night that felt almost too quiet, with the faint sound of rustling leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. But in one suburban neighborhood, that silence would soon be shattered by the deafening sound of gunfire. 17-year-old Isabella Scavelli, a promising young woman with a bright future ahead of her, would never make it home that night. She was shot in front of her own house, in front of her mother, as she tried to escape, a bullet to the back, her life cut short in a matter of seconds. But this wasn't a random act of violence. No, this was something far more calculated, something premeditated. The truth behind her murder was not as simple as a moment of rage. It was the result of a long, twisted plan to protect a secret that would unravel the lives of everyone involved. The bullet hit her in the back. She fell, collapsing onto the concrete, and in those final moments, her mother would watch as life drained from her daughter's body. In a cruel twist, the woman, herself wounded, fell beside her daughter, helpless, unable to do anything but witness the execution of a life she had fought so hard to protect. The gunfire stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. And with that silence came the question, why? Why would someone do this? Why would anyone go so far as to murder a teenager in cold blood? Was this just another senseless crime of violence? Or was there something far more terrifying at play? Something darker, something that had been carefully orchestrated, like a deadly game where the victim had no chance of winning. Arranged by the very person who should have been the last to hurt her, the man who had everything to lose, and who would stop at nothing to protect himself. But how far would a person go to conceal their darkest secret? Would they go so far as to kill a teenager simply to silence her, to prevent her from speaking out, from revealing the truth? On February 7, 2023, Isabella Scavelli, a 17-year-old high school student, was fatally shot outside her home in Hernando County, Florida. She had been brave enough to come forward, to report an assault that no one should ever have to endure. She and her mother had gone to the police, filing a report that would change everything. It wasn't just any accusation, it was a claim against a man named Leonard White, someone who should have been above suspicion. But that was the thing about secrets, they're dangerous. And when they begin to unravel, they don't always go quietly. Leonard White was a man with a past, a man who had learned to manipulate those around him to avoid the consequences of his actions. To some, he appeared to be just another face in the crowd, someone you might pass by without a second thought. But for those who knew him well, the darkness beneath his surface was something more chilling. White wasn't just any man. He was someone who had something to protect, his reputation, his freedom, and, ultimately, his life. Isabella Scavelli's life would be the price for his fear. The following day after the sexual assault report, White set into motion a plan so cold, so calculated, that it's difficult to believe the man behind it was capable of such malice. But that's what fear does to people. It blinds them. It pushes them to the edge of reason and into the arms of desperation. Enter Sheldon Robinson, White's 22-year-old cousin. Robinson wasn't just an accomplice, he was a pawn in a much larger game. A desperate man willing to do anything for the right price. Robinson didn't know it then, but this simple decision would mark the beginning of a downward spiral, one that would lead to the tragic death of a teenager, and ultimately, his own undoing. Robinson was offered $6,000. That was the price for Isabella's life, a sum that White believed would ensure his safety, his escape from the truth that was closing in on him. Robinson took the money, just like a man desperate to escape his own struggles. But what he didn't realize was that the cost of betrayal is always higher than you can imagine. On February 7, 2023, Robinson showed up at Isabella's home, just hours after the assault had been reported. With a coldness in his eyes and a gun in his hand, he knocked on the door. The moment it opened, the barrage of gunfire began. Isabella, caught off guard, ran. She ran for her life, as anyone would in her place. But there was nowhere to hide. Robinson's aim was steady, and the bullet that struck Isabella came from behind, just as she tried to flee. She collapsed onto the ground, her life slipping away in an instant. Her mother, who had been shot multiple times but still clinging to life, watched as her daughter died. She was left to mourn her child's death in the most horrific way possible, an innocent girl, murdered for nothing more than being a threat to someone else's secret. The attack was brutal, but even more horrifying was what followed. The aftermath of the murder, the lengths to which White and Robinson would go to cover their tracks, would only make the story darker. A plan was set in motion, a plan that involved not only the murder of an innocent teenager but a systematic attempt to destroy any evidence, to make the investigation seem like a hopeless case. But the law had its eyes on them, and every move they made would be scrutinized. Isabella Scavelli was, by all accounts, a beacon of hope and potential. A 17-year-old high school senior, she had big dreams, dreams that many of us take for granted. She was the kind of girl who shone brightly in every room she entered, with a smile that could light up even the darkest corners. Her family, especially her mother, was her rock. The two shared a bond that went far beyond the typical mother-daughter relationship. They were best friends, confidants, and the world to each other. In the pictures that now sit in a family album, Isabella is full of life, radiating joy. There's a particular one, where she's holding a trophy at a high school event, her face lit with pride, her mother beside her, clapping and cheering her on. These were the moments that defined her, moments of laughter, triumph, and love. Isabella was more than just a student, she was a force of nature, someone destined for greatness. She had plans, goals. She wanted to attend college, perhaps become a writer, to change the world with her words. The promise of the future was within her reach. Her life, despite the typical teenage challenges, seemed to be headed in the right direction, filled with the hope and possibilities that come with youth. But that light, that radiant future, was stolen in the blink of an eye. No one could have imagined that someone would want to snuff out that promise so brutally. No one could have imagined that someone close to her would orchestrate such a dark fate. The night before her death, Isabella and her mother took a step that would forever alter their lives. On February 6, 2023, they walked into the Hernando County Sheriff's Office and made a report against Leonard White, accusing him of sexual assault. Isabella, despite her young age, found the courage to speak out, to give her voice to something that was far too often silenced. She didn't know what would happen after that, all she knew was that she had to do it. The weight of what she had endured was heavy on her shoulders, but she hoped, like anyone would, that coming forward would lead to justice. Isabella's mother, who stood by her side, was equally brave. She too had been through the trauma of witnessing what had happened to her daughter. In the police report, they described the events of the night, the assault, the fear, and the aftermath. This act of courage, however, would soon come with an unimaginable consequence. They had no way of knowing that their decision to report the assault would make them the targets of a violent retaliation. For Isabella, the weight of the report was not just the act of filing an accusation, it was a dangerous declaration against someone who would stop at nothing to protect himself. But Isabella did not see it that way at the time. She thought she was doing the right thing. She trusted the system, trusted the idea that speaking the truth would protect her, would keep her safe. But when the report was made, everything changed. For someone like Leonard White, someone who had lived a life built on lies and deceit, the thought of facing the consequences was too much. And so, in his mind, there was only one way to silence Isabella, to make sure she never had the chance to testify, to tell the world what he had done. In that instant, Isabella became a threat, a target. She had become the last thing standing between White and the consequences he so desperately feared. Isabella's decision to come forward took an extraordinary amount of bravery. It's easy to imagine that, deep down, she knew the consequences of what she was doing, but she chose to act anyway. She was a teenager, yet she stood tall in the face of fear. In the interviews conducted with those close to her, they describe Isabella as a girl who always sought to make the right choices, a girl who was full of life but not naive. Her decision to file the report wasn't made lightly. And yet, behind that courage, there must have been fear. The kind of fear that creeps in when you realize that the person you've accused might be capable of anything. Did Isabella understand the danger she was in? Did she feel the weight of the world pressing down on her? As a mother and daughter, they had come together to make the report, believing that they were doing the right thing, trusting in a system that would protect them. But Isabella's bravery may have been the very thing that sealed her fate. The psychological toll didn't end with the report, it only escalated. Every day that passed after the report was filed must have felt like a ticking clock, each second carrying more dread, more uncertainty. Did Isabella think about the potential consequences of her actions? Did she worry that her life was in jeopardy, that the man she accused would retaliate in the worst way possible? Her life was forever changed by that decision. What she couldn't have known at the time was that this would be the beginning of the end, a tragic, brutal end to a life that had barely begun. Isabella Scavelli was not just a victim of a senseless murder, she was a young woman whose bravery ultimately cost her everything. She faced the darkness head-on, thinking she was making the right choice, not realizing that those who live in the shadows would go to unimaginable lengths to protect their secrets. And in the end, she paid the ultimate price for her courage. What could have been done to protect her? At first glance, Leonard White seemed like just another face in the crowd, a man who could pass for someone's neighbor, a man whose life appeared typical on the surface. In his late 30s, he had an unremarkable job, lived in a modest neighborhood, and kept to himself. To most people, he was a quiet, reserved figure who blended into the background. But behind the facade of normalcy, there existed a much darker reality, one built on manipulation, control, and secrecy. White wasn't a stranger to criminal activity. In fact, it had been a part of his life for years, lurking beneath his calm exterior. He had found ways to manipulate those around him, twisting them into doing his bidding, all while hiding his true intentions. His history was one of calculated actions, each step taken to preserve his own image and protect himself from the consequences of his actions. He was the kind of person who would do anything to avoid facing his demons, someone who believed that his own interests and safety came above everything else. And then there was his cousin, Sheldon Robinson. Leonard White had a complicated relationship with Sheldon, a young man looking for guidance, desperate for a way out of his own troubled life. White saw this desperation as an opportunity, a chance to use Sheldon as a pawn in his game. The two of them shared more than just family ties, there was an unspoken bond, one rooted in manipulation. White knew how to push Sheldon's buttons, how to make him feel indebted and reliant. It was this relationship, this twisted dynamic, that led to Isabella's death. When White made the decision to silence Isabella, he didn't do it alone. He knew that Sheldon, despite his youth and lack of experience, could be convinced to carry out the most brutal of tasks. In exchange for a promise of money, White planted the seed in Sheldon's mind. He offered him $6,000, a sum that, to Sheldon, seemed like a way out, an escape from his financial struggles and personal demons. And so, the plan was set into motion. The payment would be enough to ensure Sheldon's compliance, enough to seal Isabella's fate. It was a transaction born out of fear, manipulation, and greed. Sheldon Robinson was 22 years old when he became the key figure in the murder-for-hire plot that would forever alter his life, and the lives of so many others. From the outside, Sheldon appeared to be just another young man trying to find his place in the world, but underneath, there was a desperation, a sense of hopelessness that made him vulnerable to White's manipulation. He was a man torn between loyalty to his family and his own struggles, and this internal conflict made him an easy target for someone like White. Sheldon wasn't a criminal by nature, but he was willing to do whatever it took to escape the cycle of poverty and failure that seemed to define his existence. When White approached him with the proposition, Sheldon was at a low point in his life, tired, struggling, and looking for a way to make it all stop. The offer of money, the promise of a way out, was too enticing to refuse. But what Sheldon didn't realize was that he was being drawn into a situation far darker than he could have ever imagined. Through phone records, investigators would later uncover just how deeply Sheldon was involved in the plan. Messages exchanged between him and White revealed the nature of their arrangement. Sheldon had no idea that this seemingly simple job would spiral into a nightmare, one that would cost an innocent girl her life and cost him his future. The texts were chilling, Sheldon asking questions, White providing answers, and all the while, the plan to kill Isabella moving closer to reality. Sheldon was not a killer by nature, but the desperation in his voice, the way he spoke about his situation, showed just how easily he had been swayed. He was eager to please White, to prove himself, to gain the approval of the only family member who seemed to offer him any sense of direction. And when he was sent to do the unthinkable, to murder a teenager in cold blood, he did it, not because he wanted to, but because he felt there was no other choice. The $6,000 was a lifeline, a temporary escape from the overwhelming pressure that had been crushing him. In his mind, this was a job. A job that would be over quickly, with a payment that would solve all his problems. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that this decision would destroy his life forever. The weight of his actions, the murder of an innocent girl, would follow him, haunting him every day. While Sheldon Robinson was the primary accomplice, he wasn't alone in this deadly plot. Enter Keyshawn Woods, another name that would be forever linked to Isabella Scavelli's murder. Woods, though not as central to the crime as Sheldon, played a crucial role in the execution of the plan. His involvement was not driven by the same desperation as Sheldon's, but rather a desire to align himself with the wrong crowd, a need for acceptance that led him down a dangerous path. Woods, at the time, was no stranger to criminal activity. He was involved in the darker aspects of the world that White and Sheldon inhabited, drugs, violence, and the underworld that thrived in the shadows. But his role in Isabella's murder was more passive than active. He was recruited by Robinson to assist in the attack, though his actions were secondary to the main assault. Still, his involvement would prove crucial in the investigation. After the murder, Woods tried to distance himself from the crime, but investigators weren't fooled. They pieced together the various threads of the plot, using phone records and witness testimony to trace Woods' role. It was clear that Woods had been part of the conspiracy, though his level of involvement wasn't as direct as Sheldon's. Nevertheless, Woods' participation in the cover-up would come back to haunt him. In the months following Isabella's death, authorities closed in on Woods. As the investigation deepened, Woods realized that there was no way out, no way to avoid the consequences of his involvement. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to his role in the crime. His decision to cooperate with investigators, to reveal what he knew about the plan, would be pivotal in securing the convictions of White and Robinson. Woods' plea was a small part of the justice that Isabella's family would eventually see, but it was also a reminder of the complexity of the case. What began as a simple, cold-blooded murder-for-hire plot soon revealed the tangled web of individuals involved, each with their own motivations, each contributing in some way to the loss of an innocent life. For Woods, the road to redemption would be long, but the price for his actions would be paid in full, as it would for White and Robinson. The plan to kill Isabella was anything but hasty. Leonard White had meticulously orchestrated every detail, his mind working with cold precision to ensure that nothing would go wrong. It wasn't just about the murder, it was about control, about making sure that Isabella would never get the chance to testify, that she would never reveal what he had done. White knew that, after the assault report was filed, everything was at risk. His past crimes, the ones he thought he had hidden so well, were now at the brink of exposure. To him, there was only one way to handle the situation: silence her forever. But White wasn't going to risk being anywhere near the scene. He knew better than to get his hands dirty, to be directly involved in the execution of a crime that could end his life as he knew it. So, he came up with a plan that would keep him distant but still very much in control. The solution was simple: he would use his cousin, Sheldon Robinson. White knew Robinson was desperate, financially struggling, and always eager to please. A combination of those factors made him the perfect candidate to carry out the job. But White also knew that if Robinson was going to do this, he needed an alibi, something that would place him miles away from the scene when the murder occurred. So, without hesitation, White packed his bags and took a trip to Georgia, ensuring that he had an airtight alibi. As White made his way out of state, Robinson was left behind to fulfill the grim task. With no one to witness the true nature of the crime, no one to place the blame squarely on White, he could sit back and watch the plot unfold from a distance. Robinson, unaware of just how much danger he was really in, believed the job was simple enough: a shooting, a cleanup, and a payday. But nothing about this was simple. The plan was carefully constructed, with every detail worked out. Robinson was given instructions, weapons, and money to carry out the deed. White's manipulation of Robinson, his use of him as a pawn in a deadly game, had begun, and there was no turning back. The night of February 7, 2023, was supposed to be just another evening. But for Isabella Scavelli, it would be her last. Sheldon Robinson, armed and ready, made his way to the Scavelli home. The cold air bit at his skin as he approached the door, the weight of the gun in his pocket growing heavier with each step. Robinson wasn't sure what he had expected when he knocked on that door, but he couldn't have imagined the horror that would follow. He was no stranger to violence, but this was different. There was a weight to this crime that he hadn't anticipated. Yet, the promise of $6,000, the lure of a better life, was enough to silence any lingering doubts. As he stood there, his heart racing, he knocked on the door. Isabella's mother answered, and Robinson wasted no time. With a steady hand, he pulled out the weapon and opened fire. The first shot rang out, followed by several more. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of destruction. Isabella, who had been inside the house, heard the noise and rushed to the door, desperate to figure out what was happening. But as she opened the door, Robinson was already aiming his gun. She saw the muzzle flash just before she turned to run. In those final moments, Isabella tried to escape, her instincts screaming at her to flee. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest, but the bullet struck her in the back, cutting her down in an instant. She fell hard onto the pavement, her life slipping away with every breath. The shock of the moment was almost unbearable. There, on the ground, was a young girl who had barely had the chance to live, her life stolen because of a decision made by someone she had never thought could harm her. Robinson watched as Isabella fell, and then, as if on cue, he turned and fled the scene. His role in the plot was complete, or so he thought. The murder wasn't over, though. Robinson had done his part, but there was still the matter of Isabella's mother. She had been shot as well, left bleeding on the ground beside her daughter. The woman's cries filled the air as she struggled to stay conscious, to hold on long enough to get help. But nothing would bring her daughter back. And in those final, agonizing moments, her mother was left to face the harshest reality, the brutal murder of her child, an innocent girl whose only crime had been speaking out. Isabella's mother, though wounded, wasn't ready to die, not yet. The shock of seeing her daughter gunned down right before her eyes was enough to nearly send her into unconsciousness. But somehow, she managed to hold on. She could feel the blood pooling beneath her, the pain from the gunshots radiating through her body. Her breathing was shallow, but she didn't give up. She couldn't give up. Not with Isabella still out there, her life hanging in the balance. As the world around her spun out of control, Isabella's mother lay there, unable to move, unable to stop the inevitable. Her mind raced. She could hear the sound of sirens growing closer, but all she could think about was her daughter, her beautiful, innocent daughter, lying motionless on the ground. The pain of seeing her daughter die was unbearable, but the terror of knowing that her own life was slipping away with every breath made the experience even more harrowing. Every heartbeat felt like it might be her last. And yet, somehow, she kept going. She clung to life with everything she had left. In those fleeting moments, she thought about everything she had lost, the love of her daughter, the future they had planned together, and the family that had been torn apart in an instant. By the time first responders arrived, it was too late for Isabella. The paramedics did what they could for her mother, stabilizing her enough to rush her to the hospital. But there was no saving Isabella. Her life had been snatched away, taken by a man who had feared the truth she could tell. Isabella's mother would survive, but she would never be the same. The trauma of that night would live with her forever, a mother forced to witness the senseless loss of her child, a loss that would never truly heal. The horror of what happened on February 7, 2023, would remain etched in her memory, a painful reminder of a crime that should never have occurred. The murder of Isabella Scavelli was brutal, but as with all crimes, the truth eventually starts to reveal itself, often in ways that criminals fail to anticipate. The investigation began in the aftermath of the shooting, with law enforcement and forensic experts working tirelessly to gather evidence that would shed light on the cold-blooded execution that took place outside the Scavelli home. Every detail counted. Every piece of evidence was a clue that could unlock the mystery of who was behind the killing, and why. The first step in the investigation was to secure the crime scene. Isabella's mother had survived, but her daughter lay dead on the pavement, and the home was now a crime scene. Forensic experts combed over the area, looking for anything that could help them piece together the events of that tragic night. The first critical piece of evidence came from ballistics analysis. The investigators recovered shell casings from the ground, which were traced back to the handgun used in the shooting. A firearm was a common tool of violence, but it wasn't just the weapon itself that told the story. It was the trajectory of the bullets, the distance between the shooter and the victim, and the pattern of the blood spatter that gave detectives their first real insight into the crime. They determined that Isabella had been running when she was shot, struck in the back as she attempted to flee. The position of the body, the angle of the gunfire, these details helped paint a clear picture of what happened in those final moments. Blood spatter analysis further confirmed that Isabella had been shot at close range, with the trajectory and distribution of the blood marking her attempts to escape her killer. But it wasn't just the physical evidence at the crime scene that would crack the case. Detectives turned their attention to the electronic evidence, knowing that in today's world, phones and messages often tell a story no one can hide. Robinson's phone, in particular, would become a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Messages sent between Robinson and White were uncovered, detailing their interactions in the days leading up to the murder. It was clear from these texts that Robinson had been recruited by White to carry out the murder-for-hire plot. White had paid Robinson in cash and drugs, $6,000 and a stash of cocaine, as compensation for Isabella's life. Through painstaking digital forensics, investigators uncovered Robinson's efforts to cover his tracks. He had erased messages, deleted calls, and attempted to wipe his phone of any trace that could connect him to the crime. But it was too late. What he thought would be a foolproof plan only left a trail of evidence for the investigators to follow. Every step Robinson took to hide the truth only seemed to push him closer to being caught. After the murder, Robinson went to great lengths to cover his tracks, believing he could erase his involvement and escape the consequences of his actions. But no crime goes unnoticed, not when there are so many loose ends, and Robinson was no exception. One of the most telling pieces of evidence in the case was Robinson's desperate attempt to clean up the scene after the murder. He knew that leaving any trace of his involvement would inevitably lead investigators to him. So, he began reaching out to others for help. In text messages recovered from his phone, Robinson asked potential accomplices for help with what he called a cleanup job. He even went as far as to show off his earnings from White, sending pictures of the cash and cocaine he had received as payment for the murder. These messages revealed his cold indifference to the crime, a man who saw murder as just another job. But his attempt to dispose of evidence was equally telling. In the days following the shooting, Robinson tried to hide the murder weapon, believing that removing the physical evidence would make him untouchable. He buried the handgun in a wooded area behind his house, thinking it would never be found. He erased his digital footprint, trying to make it seem like he had nothing to do with the crime. But just as the bullet left a permanent mark on Isabella's body, Robinson's actions left a permanent trail that would eventually lead investigators to him. Authorities also found suspicious bank transactions and phone call records, showing that Robinson had been making arrangements to hide the money and drugs he had received as payment. These records, along with the recovered texts, provided a clear picture of his involvement in the murder. Robinson's efforts to clean up after the crime were futile, and with every step he took to cover his tracks, he only dug himself deeper into a hole. As the investigation continued, it became clear that both Leonard White and Sheldon Robinson were not just involved in the murder, they were actively working to hinder the investigation. Their attempts to obstruct justice were relentless and calculated. They weren't just trying to cover up the crime, they were trying to manipulate the system, to make sure they were never caught. White, from his out-of-state location in Georgia, remained in contact with Robinson, giving him further instructions on how to handle the aftermath of the murder. Messages between the two men showed that they had discussed disposing of evidence and making false statements to law enforcement. At one point, White even suggested that Robinson should move the murder weapon and get rid of any evidence that could tie them to the crime. It was clear that White had no intention of taking responsibility for the murder. He was willing to let Robinson bear the full weight of the crime while he remained safely out of the picture. But investigators were not easily fooled. The more they dug, the more they realized that this wasn't just a case of one man acting alone, it was a deliberate, orchestrated effort to cover up the truth. White and Robinson's repeated attempts to manipulate the case were uncovered as detectives gathered more and more evidence. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when investigators executed a second search warrant at Robinson's home months after the murder. This time, they found the murder weapon, buried in the woods behind his house, just as they had suspected. The discovery of the gun was a turning point in the case. It was the piece of evidence that tied everything together. And it wasn't just the gun. Investigators found traces of Robinson's involvement in every part of the crime, from his messages with White to the financial transactions and phone calls. Each piece of evidence built a clear case against both Robinson and White. White's efforts to cover up the crime, to keep his hands clean, had failed. The more he tried to manipulate the investigation, the more he exposed himself. The investigation had uncovered the truth, and the pieces were falling into place. Both White and Robinson had underestimated the resolve of the investigators who were determined to bring them to justice. Just when investigators thought they were closing in on Leonard White and Sheldon Robinson, another horrifying revelation emerged, one that would send shockwaves through the case. It wasn't enough for White and Robinson to simply cover up the murder of Isabella Scavelli. They had already silenced one witness, but now, they were planning to kill another, someone who could testify against them. This new witness, a crucial link in the investigation, was someone who knew too much, a person who had seen the darker side of White's actions. The plot was chilling. White and Robinson, after all they had done, still felt the need to eliminate anyone who could threaten their freedom. This wasn't just a murder for hire, it was a coordinated attempt to erase anyone who could expose their crimes. The fact that they were willing to go this far, even after Isabella's death, showed the lengths to which they were willing to go to protect themselves. They had already taken one life, and now, they were preparing to take another, all to ensure their dark secrets remained hidden. Investigators, though, were not blind to the danger. As they pieced together the evidence, they discovered that White and Robinson had been in contact with yet another accomplice, someone they had recruited to carry out the second murder. This attempt was foiled just in time, thanks to the vigilance of law enforcement. The chilling realization hit hard: White and Robinson weren't just guilty of Isabella's murder, they had planned to kill again. And the coldness of their intentions was enough to send a clear message to investigators. These were men who would stop at nothing to avoid paying the price for their actions. What drives a person to commit murder? What pushes someone to kill not once, but twice, in cold blood, to protect their own secrets? To understand the horrific lengths White and Robinson were willing to go, we must look deeper into their minds. Psychologists and criminologists interviewed for this case offer valuable insights into the psychology of these two men. Leonard White, in particular, exhibited signs of someone who had been living a life built on lies and deception. His need to control everything around him, his manipulation of those closest to him, and his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way pointed to a man consumed by fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of losing control. Fear of facing the consequences of his actions. White had built his life on secrets, and when those secrets began to unravel, he would go to any lengths to preserve his own freedom. For Sheldon Robinson, his actions were fueled by a combination of desperation and misguided loyalty. He wasn't a natural-born criminal, but the promise of money and the manipulation by his cousin blinded him to the gravity of the situation. Experts explained that Robinson likely saw the crime as a way out, a way to escape the struggles that had defined his life. But his desperation led him to take part in a plan far darker than he could have imagined. His willingness to follow White's lead, without questioning the morality of his actions, speaks to his psychological state, a young man lost, looking for direction, and easily manipulated by someone he trusted. Together, White and Robinson's motivations were intertwined: fear, greed, guilt, and power. They were two men who felt cornered, driven by the need to protect themselves at any cost. Their attempts to kill again only revealed how deeply they were consumed by their own need to remain untouchable. For them, it wasn't about justice, it was about survival. The shocking twist of their second plot to kill a witness brought their true natures to light. These weren't simply men trying to cover up a crime, they were willing to kill anyone who could expose them. In the end, their fear and desperation would be their downfall, as the investigation continued to peel away the layers of their twisted minds, revealing the full extent of their actions. After months of investigation, the day of reckoning finally arrived. Leonard White and Sheldon Robinson were about to face the consequences of their actions in a courtroom that would reveal the true extent of their crimes. The prosecution was ready, armed with a mountain of evidence that would tie both men directly to the murder of Isabella Scavelli. As the trial began, the air was thick with tension, each word spoken carrying the weight of a young life lost. The prosecutor stood before the jury, methodically laying out the case. From the forensic evidence to the damning phone records, every piece of the puzzle fit together. The ballistics evidence, the blood spatter analysis, the texts between Robinson and White, each element told the same story. White had orchestrated the murder from afar, pulling strings like a puppet master, while Robinson, desperate and manipulated, carried out the execution. The messages that linked them, the phone calls, the payment for murder, they couldn't be ignored. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that painted the perpetrators as monsters. The prosecutor also called upon family members and law enforcement officers who had been involved in the investigation. Isabella's mother, though still grieving, bravely took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted the horror of watching her daughter die in front of her, but her words carried the raw emotion of a mother who had lost everything. Her testimony was a powerful moment in the trial, and it reminded the jury of what was at stake. This wasn't just a case of cold-blooded murder. This was the senseless killing of a young girl, and the courtroom felt the weight of that loss with every word. For Isabella's family, the trial was an emotional roller coaster. Every day in the courtroom was another reminder of the pain they had endured since February 7, 2023. Each testimony brought them back to the night of the murder, reliving the moments when they had lost Isabella. The thought of hearing about their daughter's death over and over was unbearable, but they stayed in the courtroom, determined to see justice done. Isabella's mother, in particular, was the emotional center of the trial. She had fought to bring the truth to light, and now, she was watching the men responsible for her daughter's death stand trial. Her pain was evident, but so was her resilience. Despite everything, she held her head high, knowing that this was the final step in her fight for justice. The trial wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about finding closure. For Isabella's family, the satisfaction of seeing White and Robinson face the consequences of their actions was bittersweet. It would never bring Isabella back, but it was a small victory in a long and painful journey toward healing. When the verdict was read, and both men were found guilty, the room let out a collective sigh of relief. Justice had been served, but the scars of that day would remain forever. After the trial, the moment of reckoning finally came. White and Robinson were about to face their punishment. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as both men stood before the judge for their sentencing. The weight of their actions had already been made clear, but now it was time for the law to impose its judgment. Leonard White, the mastermind behind Isabella's death, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His life, once filled with manipulation and control, was now reduced to the confines of a prison cell. Sheldon Robinson, the cousin who had carried out the murder, was given the same sentence. It was a mandatory life sentence for both men, a reminder that justice had no mercy for those who took innocent lives. As the sentences were read aloud, Isabella's family sat silently in the courtroom. For them, this moment marked the end of a long and painful journey. But the reality of the life sentences was bittersweet. While the men who had robbed them of their daughter would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, it would never bring Isabella back. Her absence would forever leave a hole in their hearts. But justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been served. The reactions in the courtroom were mixed. Isabella's family, though relieved, still struggled to find solace. They had fought for so long to get to this point, and now that they had it, they weren't sure how to move forward. The closure they had hoped for was complicated by the unfillable void left by Isabella's murder. For White and Robinson, the sentencing marked the beginning of the end for their freedom, but it also marked the end of any hope they had of ever making amends. The impact of Isabella's murder wasn't confined to her family. It rippled through the entire community, leaving scars that would never truly heal. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers felt the weight of the tragedy. The small, tight-knit community in Hernando County was left shaken and confused. How could something like this happen in their quiet neighborhood? How could one person's desperate actions lead to the death of a teenager who had so much to live for? Local law enforcement and experts weighed in on the broader effects of the crime. The police officers who had worked tirelessly on the case shared their feelings of disbelief. "It's the kind of case that sticks with you," one investigator remarked. "You don't just forget a crime like this. It changes you." The community's sense of security had been shattered, and it would take time, perhaps years, for the healing to begin. Boers who had once felt safe now found themselves questioning their surroundings, wondering if they truly knew those around them. Experts also pointed out that crimes like this one have a long-lasting effect on a community's collective psyche. It's not just about the legal process or the punishment, it's about the emotional toll it takes on everyone involved. The fear, the grief, the helplessness, they stay long after the conviction, embedding themselves in the very fabric of the community. As the final segment of this story unfolds, we hear from Isabella's family, who have borne the heaviest burden. Isabella's mother, through tear-filled eyes, speaks to the camera, her voice both heavy and resolute. "Justice doesn't bring her back," she says, her words slow but measured. "Nothing can. But I hope that, somehow, her death means something. That we all learn from this, that we don't let fear and lies control our lives." For Isabella's family, the question remains, does justice truly bring peace? Or is it simply a step in the long journey of grief and healing? They express a mixture of relief and sorrow. "We'll never get over this," her mother continues, "but at least we know the truth is out there now. At least we know she didn't die in vain." At the heart of this tragedy lies a moral conflict that's difficult to ignore, the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves from exposure, and the ultimate cost of betrayal. Leonard White and Sheldon Robinson were not born monsters. They were men who, driven by fear and desperation, chose to destroy a young life to safeguard their own secrets. Their actions remind us of the power of self-preservation, of how fear can twist one's sense of right and wrong. The betrayal that Isabella endured wasn't just a physical attack, it was the ultimate betrayal of trust. A young woman, who had no idea that her courage to speak out would cost her everything, was silenced by those who were supposed to care for her. The consequences of their actions reverberate far beyond the courtroom, touching the lives of everyone who knew Isabella. The legacy of such crime stretches far beyond the immediate victims. It leaves scars on families, on communities, and on the justice system itself. As we reflect on this tragedy, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can be learned? How can we prevent such senseless acts in the future? This case serves as a somber reminder that crime, once committed, is not just an isolated event, it impacts everyone, creating ripples that echo for years to come.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.